Hey, welcome to the Reboot Recovery Show. I'm Evan Owens, your host. Really excited. We're going to continue part 2 now of a conversation with Bryan Flanery, one of the original gangsters of Reboot. He's been around a long, long time. And today what we're going to be talking about is some of the changes that the military is undergoing, how Reboot is responding, and what that might mean for you or people that you care about. There's going to be some rich, really good stuff, some really encouraging stuff in today's episode. So I hope you'll stick around. All right, welcome to the Reboot Recovery Show. I'm Evan Owens, your host. Excited here to be with Bryan Flanery again. During our last episode, if you missed that, go back and listen to it maybe after this one. Some hilarious moments in that one. We talked about some of the things we've done around the world traveling. Bryan shared an incredible part of his story, how we met, and just some really good stuff. And, you know, I was thinking about one of the stories that we didn't tell. We've made a habit. Some of you guys who have done travel and business, a lot of times people who are very loving want to invite us to stay at their homes when we are traveling, and we've made a tough decision that we only do hotels and now, because I'll never forget, I went with a buddy of ours and we ended up sharing a twin bed together for the evening. Was all that they had, and I was freezing because all they had was a top sheet, and he's a bit of a hairy individual. And during the evening, no, someone else, I was cold, and I said, "I'm cold," and he said, "No problem, here, just pull my chest hair around you like a blanket and roll over." And, you know, I got to admit, it's warmer than you might think, you know? No, just kidding. But that's a real story as well. And so we're going to share some more funny stories. But, Bryan, you're seeing some incredible things happen in the military. But a lot of people are sort of seeing some good news and some bad news, but you've got some unique perspectives. So tell us, what's going on? What's kind of the state of things for our U.S. military right now? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so from my perspective, from where we're at, like, you know, the conflicts have decreased. Like, there are people alive today who have never known our country to be at peace. They've only known war. And I mean, the last conflict war that we were in, OIF, for the first time in American history, we had fathers sending their children to the same wars that they fought in.
Or deploying together. I even heard some stories like that, which is amazing.
And so what's crazy is, as things have decreased, like, there's this narrative that, like, oh man, things are over, things are slowing down. But, like, that's all good news. Like, you know, there are, when I was in 2013, if you were walking around Fort Campbell, it was tough to see anybody you didn't see very many people E3, so private first class and above, without deployment patches.
Right.
And now they're not as prevalent around the base. Right. Which is, again, good news. Like, people aren't deploying as fast. The op tempo has slowed significantly. You know, when I was in 2013, when I was at the WTB, the Warrior Transition Battalion for sick, injured, and ill service members, there was over 800 service members there, and over 80% was combat wounded. Today, there's 104 service members there, with less than 4% being combat wounded.
Wow.
So,
all the way down from, what'd you say, 300 and what?
Yeah, 800.
800 and something down to 100.
That's right.
That's amazing.
And, like, all of this is good news. Like, there are situations in which people are painting it to be a bad thing. Like, that's a good thing.
Right, but I also hear people say, we've even heard this, you know, from some donors, right? People that support Reboot. Hey, you know, I know we're done with combat. WTB numbers are down from 800 to 100. Veterans aren't hurting the same way anymore. Sure. I'm deciding to reallocate my money. I'm deciding to reallocate my effort into some other well-deserving need. But that's not really what we're seeing on the front lines, right? I mean, we're not seeing this huge reduction of things. What is that about? Because if they're not combat veterans, like, what's wrong? I mean, tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's been a bunch of studies that have been released this year, done by multiple different sources, and one of them that I found most fascinating showed that 70% of people that serve in the military have had multiple childhood traumas. Multiple, right? And so that being the case, it's interesting because we know data shows us that if you experience trauma as a child, it affects you in a much more significant way as an adult.
Right.
Right. So you have hurt people that are going into situations and re-hurting
destined to hurt them. Yeah. Situations of high hurt ratio.
That's right.
Yeah. People to hurt ratio is high.
That's right. And so with all of that being the case, like one of the things that we started looking at Fort Campbell and now in multiple other places as well is what would it look like if we brought Trauma Reboot to Post, and would people come? That was a big question.
And Trauma Reboot, just for people to know, explain that, just in case there's some listeners who maybe don't know about that program.
Yeah, so of course we have three programs at Reboot Recovery. We have Trauma Reboot, Reboot First Responder, and Reboot Combat Recovery. Of course, First Responder and Combat are dedicated towards the population that they're reaching. Trauma Reboot is more for basic trauma, right? For more, I hate the term everyday trauma, but it's for
trauma. Anyone who's gone through trauma might be a better way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. And so what's interesting is we announced that we were going to bring it to Post. We sent some flyers out, sent some emails, went and talked to some people. Then we just kind of stood back and waited. And what was crazy is we had service members show up. We had spouses. We had DOD civilians. We had retirees. We had some regular civilians. Like, we had this whole potpourri of population that came.
Whoa, that was amazing. A potpourri of population. A people potpourri of populace. That's amazing. Bryan just used potpourri. I just want to say, can you spell potpourri? Give it a shot.
P-O-T.
That's right. You got it right. It's not pot. It's potpourri.
Yeah. Anyway.
It's good.
So
potpourri is a word that do people still have potpourri, or is it all essential oils now? Because potpourri was like a thing when I was a kid. Remember the little crunchy wood chips like people would use as potpourri? Is that still a thing?
I've thought of potpourri since my grandma.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Walking into
if you still use potpourri at home, we'd love for you to email us a picture of you using potpourri. Or send it to us on Instagram. I'll reshare it and be like, who remembers this? Because I haven't seen potpourri in a while.
Yeah, it has been a while.
Anyway, we digress. You were saying we had this mixture of people. Oh, yeah, a melting pot, if you will. A potpourri pot of people.
Yeah, and man, it was just so good. So many people came, like...
What were some of the things? I mean, what were some of, like, I don't want you to tell their stories. I don't want to out them. But high level, what are some of the issues?
There was domestic assaults. There was childhood trauma, both physical, mental, and emotional abuse. There was a car accident. There was the loss of a father unexpectly.
Loss of a child, I know, was one of them.
Loss of a child. And so all these different people... from all these different walks of life, all these different stories, all these different forms of trauma. And when they came together, like, it was beautiful just to watch them heal together. And what was really crazy is after group was over, we met and got coffee and just kind of, if you're not familiar with Reboot, we end with a graduation just to celebrate the participants and what they've been through. And after graduation, we all met one more time and just got some coffee and we're just hanging out. And I asked them, because we had 3 service members that were there, and I asked them, hey, would you have walked into a combat recovery? And all 3 of them said no.
Wow. Why?
Well, even one of them had deployed, but he had never seen combat.
So he felt like I would be unworthy to come to the combat recovery course, but I do have trauma.
That's right. And so he walked into the trauma reboot and wouldn't. And, we have other bases that have switched from combat to trauma recently, and they're seeing the same thing there. Like, they're seeing people coming to trauma reboot that wouldn't have come to combat recovery because they didn't feel like they were qualified enough to walk into a combat recovery. And at the same time, trauma reboot, it's just, it hits different.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how else to say it. It just hits different where, no, not everybody has serious traumas that are unresolved in their life. There are absolutely people who go through something and they walk through the mental, the physical, and the spiritual health through discipleship, through church, through counselors, and that's awesome. But there are so many people, what I'm finding with Trauma Reboot, that walk through some pretty significant stuff that had almost normalized it.
Yeah. It's actually interesting because I think that something that we learned early on, I remember reading, Nate Self's book, 2 Wars. I remember reading Combat Trauma Healing Manual, some of these books early on. And I remember thinking, all of this is extremely combat-centric language, but the principles of how you go about healing it are universal. Sure. Because wounds wound. I mean, like whether it's a cut, a deep cut, a straight cut, a crooked cut, at the end of the day, they're cuts. I mean, and there's a similar heartbeat or a similar type of wounding to them. And I remember early on when we were even learning how to do Reboot, because a lot of times people forget. I mean, Jen and I, we both did our full-time jobs for almost 5 years while leading Reboot groups 2 and 3 times a week, right? We had groups going in Nashville down Operation Stand Down. We had groups at Fort Campbell, groups in our home. And so we were, every week, I would spend Monday afternoons from like 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock preparing the discussion. I would give the discussion facilitated at like 6 to 8 o'clock, go home from like 8 to 9, rewrite based on what I just learned. And so I always say the combat recovery curriculum wasn't really written by me. It's really veteran written, veteran tested, veteran approved. Sure. Kind of like, what's it? Kix cereal, kid tested, kids approved, Kix, that's another thing. Do people still eat Kix cereal? If you eat Kix cereal, send us a picture of you eating Kix cereal.
I actually have a box of Kix in the cupboard.
I thought Kix was so gross, I had to put sugar on the Kix, which totally negated the Kix of it all.
We found it at a grocery store, and I wanted my kids to try it.
It's not terrible. Approved. Yeah, Kix is not good. Anyway, and so I felt like I got my train of thought back, is as we were leading the course, a lot of times I would find there was this interesting thing, like, yes, combat had wounded them. Yes, their deployment caused trauma. But a lot of times, it really, I would say, in addition to it being new trauma, there was this other layer of exacerbating, sort of irritating, making existing traumas worse.
Sure.
Or uncovering them.
Absolutely.
And so it was fascinating because I remember thinking, how many of these people would have come into a group if it wasn't? So I'm going the opposite of what you just said, which is some people came because it was trauma reboot, not combat. But I actually found how many of these people were we able to work with that would have never addressed the stuff 18 and younger, sure. but somehow the word combat got their attention, that neon yellow combat word. And I've reflected a lot too, and this is a question. This is a question I want our listeners and people to think about too, and I'm going to ask you. Is combat trauma more socially acceptable or easier to face and get help for than is childhood trauma?
Absolutely.
Why?
So, I think part of it is the respect that comes with the military. Right? If I walk into a room and I don't know anybody in the room, and it's some kind of a program where they're sharing, and people are standing up and saying what they're struggling, and I stand up and say, I'm dealing with PTSD from the war, right? Everybody instantly goes, got it.
Interesting.
Right? Whereas if I stand up and say, when I was a kid, XYZ happened, and I don't know how to process it, it's almost like even if it's not real, there's a perceived shame. Right? Like,
there's definitely no valor.
That's right.
Versus there is valor in combat
and
trauma.
It's expected.
Yeah.
Right? As a service member, it's expected. I mean, heck, and you know this from being around us so much. There are groups of people who believe that every service member has PTSD and every service member has gone through these crazy things, which just isn't true. Mm-hmm. Whereas with a child, most of us don't want to think that these things are happening to a child. So when people say, I went through this as a kid, they feel regret and shame.
Great.
And we feel the same regret and shame that they had to go through it.
Yeah.
And so I think is it more acceptable? In some ways, yeah, but I think it's the perception of the trauma, but I think it's also how we define trauma. Like, how many times have you been leading a group and somebody's come in and you're like, hey, what brought you here? And they point at their spouse and it's like, well, I'm only here for them. And you're like, oh, okay, cool. Well, hey, thanks for being here. And you start walking through and all of a sudden, week 7, 8, or 9, all of a sudden they're just melted because they realized all this stuff that had happened throughout their life that they didn't perceive as trauma, but they never addressed, and they stuffed it down, is now coming out, and now they're dealing with it.
Yeah. And I think that's an encouragement to people. Sometimes when we go through something traumatic as an adult, let's say we have sudden financial loss, we have a miscarriage, we have some death of a loved one, we have house fire, something. I think the tendency is to believe that is what created the spiral in our lives. That's what's created all of the trauma and all the negative emotions and all the pain and all of the hurt that we sort of pinpoint and say, this is why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. And we pour all of our counseling attention into that. We pour all of our medication management into that moment. But what I have found is sometimes the fruit, the richest healing can be saying, okay, I know what I've experienced right now is hell on earth. It is my personal intersection with the brokenness of the world, and it sucks, and it's terrible. But why also, let me ask, why am I responding the way I'm responding? Is there something in my life that kind of predisposed me to be responding the way I am to this? And I think even in my life and in the life of people that I know, sometimes when I have a negative response to something difficult in my life, it's easier for me to blame that current thing than it is to say, hey, you know what, maybe there's been some soil that some stuff has been growing in for decades.
Sure.
That maybe now I need to dig up the roots. Now, I'm not suggesting that when you're in the moment of crisis, your house burns down, that you start dealing with all your childhood stuff. I'm not suggesting that.
Right.
But I am saying maybe that house burning down can be a catalyst to, after you regain some safety and stability, now you can start to say, you know what, let me go back to my childhood now while I'm already in the momentum, because I also believe this. I believe that healing is a momentum game. Once you start to get the vibe of healing, you start to make progress, it's easier just to continue it than it is to stop for a period of time and continue back when you've got the momentum. On the flip side, I think sometimes when you're not feeling momentum, it's better to take a break and not just bang your head against the wall. I'll say that. Some people are just like, appointments and medications, just overwhelmed with it. But I say all this because I think that's something that we're seeing in the military, is that a lot of people are entering the military with traumas outside of it. And whether they're deploying or not, the rigor, the pace, the intensity of military service is it's not bringing those issues to the surface, but it's bringing issues to the surface. And people are saying maybe it's not just the military that's causing it, maybe it's something else.
Sure.
And so I think that's something that we're seeing. And we're actually starting a lot of trauma reboot groups on military bases.
That's right.
Which is
something
that we really never thought would happen.
No, and I think it's like, when we announced trauma reboot, one of the things I heard was like, you guys are just going to leave the veteran community to the side. And what was interesting is like, that was never the intention. The intention was actually the opposite, was to dig in deeper. Knowing that there were spouses and other traumas that combat recovery, as good as it was, it didn't cover it and so it's not like one or the other. The goal is
that's a good
all
point.
Three programs together for the community, right? It's all over our website. We are a community of healing.
Right. If
we were just combat recovery, it's not technically a community of healing.
Right. Because that diversity brings about healing,
right.
Like we talked about in the last episode. Yeah. I'm going to ask you one last question before we close, and this is one we did not rehearse. But I want to ask this question. You've been leading courses now for a long time. Of course, you've graduated courses. What would you say the biggest change in your life, or the biggest thing you've learned because of that? What's the biggest thing that's changed in you? How has it sort of changed you? And I'll share my answer too if you need more time to think on it. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, the biggest shift has been the way that I view grace and mercy towards people who are not like me. I think that there is a culture that I've had to learn to say, you know what? Stay the way you are. I'm not going to try to turn you into me. I think a lot of times in the kingdom, we try to do that in the Christian community. Like, okay, you became a Christian, now start acting like me. Talk like me, dress like me, walk like me, look a certain way, listen to a certain kind of music. But hanging out with the veteran community, hanging out with the first responder community, they aren't wired like me. They're wired to be sheepdogs. They're wired to be warriors. They're wired to be rough and tough. They're wired to be resilient. They're wired to do hard things that maybe I'm not able to. I'm wired to do different things that they are, and that's okay. But let them remain almost indigenous, if you will. Let them remain culturally appropriate to the culture and the community that they came from. Don't try to say, hey, with Jesus also you need to adopt the, specific way of doing Jesus. And not that I'm questioning theology. I'm not talking about theology. I'm talking about culture. And I think for me, that's the biggest shift is I've learned to realize that certain things, the dark humor, the things like I have to be comfortable letting that stuff slide. Slide's the wrong word. I want to put this in the right word. I have to be comfortable letting that person be who they are if I want them to reach the people who are like them. Be authentic. And I think that's something that I've grown in. I think I struggled in the early days to say, okay, you accepted Jesus, cool. Now you need to clean yourself up. You need to talk this way. You need to get into these things. You need to get into that. You need to start reading. You need to start, and now I've started to say like, no, keep hunting. Keep going out every weekend with the dudes and, do that, because when I see that that's the people who they're going to reach that I won't be able to reach. And I think realizing that multiplying effect and realizing that the gospel message was not just based in the Middle East and it was based around Middle Eastern culture, and outside of that it would have never spread. Realizing that Jesus is the central character and he supersedes all culture. That culture adapts, I think that's been the biggest shift in me is realizing that there is beauty in the diversity of different backgrounds, and that God brings us from those backgrounds to then turn around and reach those backgrounds. And that's been something that's really changed in my life. Maybe a little less religious.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
No, for sure.
I just tried to whittle it down to one, but like usual, I don't have one answer. I have two.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have time. Thanks for tuning in. I'm just kidding.
The first one, and I know it's on T-shirts that we've done, and people hear us say it all the time, and I think they think they understand what it means, but purpose for my pain. Mm. Because when we talk about purpose for your pain, I'm not just talking about what happened in combat. I realize that every single pain I've ever experienced my whole life, he used for his purpose. Every single one of them. Childhood, adolescent, military. And that purpose is really what changed the passion. Mm. Because I have a thing that hangs above my dresser that I read every morning. And it says, if one person. Yeah. And it's a daily reminder that if I can help one person go from where I once was to where I am now, then my whole life is worth it. Wow. And that's it.
That's it.
And at the same time, I think for me, I had so many blinders on when it came to people. Mm. I saw people the way I wanted to see people. So I saw the liars, the thieves, the trickery. I didn't trust. I mean, you know this. I didn't trust you for 2 years. Right. One of the things that Reboot taught me was how Christ sees me. Mm. But more importantly, how I should see others as Christ sees me. Right. And so when a hurting person walks into a room and they're yelling and screaming and cursing and throwing things, I don't see him as that attention-seeking person anymore. Right. I see him as that person that Christ once saw me as, is hurting and desperate. Wounded and needing help, but not knowing how to ask. And I think it's changed the way that I interact with people.
Yeah, I do think that doing Reboot definitely gives you a call to grace and a call to mercy, and a call to empathy. And so if you're joining us today and maybe you felt judged, maybe you felt shame, we just want you to hear from Bryan. We don't judge you, we don't condemn you. Right. We love you. We want you to get plugged into a course. I don't care if it's a combat course, a trauma reboot course, a first responder course. I don't care what it is. We want to help you where you're at, and that's why we make our courses so accessible. And here's what you'll probably find. And if you're a leader listening, you probably know this. Our leaders aren't perfect. They don't have everything buttoned down either. They're learning. Sure. They're learning, and somebody called them wounded healers, is what someone called them. And I think that there's so much truth to that. And I think that that's really what makes Reboot beautiful. And so, man, this has been so fun. I wish we could do 20 more episodes. Maybe we will. Maybe we'll just keep recording them. But if you're listening to this, if you have something you want us to talk about in the show, if you have questions for Bryan about what's going on in the military, if you want to get involved in leading a course, you want to get involved in attending a course, contact us. go on our website, fill out a quick contact form, email us at info@rebootrecovery.com, find us on Instagram, Facebook at rebootrecovery.com. You can get a hold of us lots of different ways. There's no reason why you can't reach out and either help people or get help for yourself. There's nothing holding you back in today's technology world. It's easy. We make it that way on purpose. So until next time, remember, I'm Evan Owens. I hope that you will keep moving forward as we overcome trauma together.